So I mentioned that in addition to variables, there are control structures, and control structures are what help you structure your code and run your code differently. Normally, PHP is very procedural. It'll go line by line, and it'll execute that line, and then the next line, and then the next line. Control structures help you break up that flow a little bit to something that is more logical for whatever it is you're trying to do. The basic kind is just an if statement. So we say if, and then in parentheses, and then brackets. Within the parentheses, you're defining something is equal to true or not true, or is equal to a certain number or not. So we have our is 8 up there. Let's say if our is less than 10, then it will execute whatever is in these brackets. Let's say 12 instead. You can also append on the end of this an else statement, which will further extend it and say if it's not true, so it'll run the one case, and if it doesn't find a match, then it will run the other, but only if you've defined an else in there.
So you always have to define else, right? No?
No, it's totally optional.
We just do nothing after.
This works just fine. In this case, it will only run what's within the brackets.
Okay.
You can also do else if, which further nests it. In this case, if it's less than 6 o'clock, say good afternoon, otherwise say good evening. And the reason it's not going to run into one of these, even though right now it's 8 a.m. and 8 a.m. is less than 6 p.m. in the clock, it would have already reached this step first. And as soon as it hits that step, it stops running the rest of the conditions.
You do it all in LJ then?
Well, it depends on how you define an hour.
Okay, so that's not a standard? Or?
It runs both ways. There's 2 different ways to define time, and we'll get into that with the date function, but you can define it as military time, or you can define it as a 12-hour clock. It works either way. But in this case, it's just a number, and we're defining that number as whatever we want it to. We've already defined it as 8 up there, further up in the script, so it's always going to compute to this. But once it hits this, and it hits this bracket, it's done. It's not going to even look at the rest of those. It's just going to skip to the end of the control structure down here, and give up and stop running.
Mm-hmm.
Or skip ahead to this and keep going. Does that make sense?
Right.
But if is the basic type, and this is where you'll use booleans, almost always. You'll say if it's too early, say good morning. Otherwise, say good afternoon or good evening. And in this case, I haven't defined any variable. I'm not comparing against anything. I'm simply saying, does it exist? If it's true, it exists. If it's defined, it exists. If you're referring to a string, if we know, if we have sname, then run this. Otherwise, if it does not exist, you would get to the else.
It's helpful too when you have HTML embedded and you're pressing a button. You know, if they hit submit, you want to check to see if the submit button was clicked. It's true.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's how you put in blocks of code into your script. So you have like a form, like Joe was saying. You have a sign up for easy form. Somebody fills in the form and they're going to submit it. You're going to want to submit that to a script somewhere. It's helpful. It depends on what kind of programmer you already like to split things up across multiple scripts, but most developers like to put everything in the same script that's related to itself, especially a short thing like that. And so you would have at the top of your script, if the form has been submitted, if it's receiving post data from the form, then run this block of code that sends it to the database, does all this stuff, and then if otherwise, run the rest of the script which has the form in it. So you have it all in one place. So the same script can do multiple things, multiple steps. If you want to define that, if you're trying to do a match, so we're saying if sname is equal to Travis, then run good morning. The reason we have double equal sign here is if I were to type just if sname equals Travis, then it's going to define at that point, because the single equal sign defines a variable. So at this point, even though it's within if, at this point I've just defined sname as Travis at this point. You have to use double equal sign to compare. Same thing, if you're comparing an integer, if you want to know if it's equal to a certain value, you have to do that. And here's where the greater than less than comes into play. You can also do less than or equal to 1 if you want to. Any questions? Okay. Just as before, if you want to do any kind of math in here, if you want to say if s name times 2 is greater than 5, you could do that. It's all inline. Beyond if, you can have a very powerful control structure which is called while. And you can say while a certain value exists, or while it is equal to something, same as the if statements. You can define within those parentheses, you can define just about any terms you want to. And what this is going to do is, as long as that is continuing to resolve as true, it's going to keep running the array. The problem is, if you don't have at some point within those brackets that it is no longer true, it's just going to run infinitely, and it's going to eventually crash your script, and that's your page is just going to time out trying to load because it's running tens of thousands of times. It just eventually stops. So at some point in here, say if we're running this while s name is equal to Travis, we're going to run some code right here in these lines, and eventually you're going to want to get to a point where s name is set to something else, so that eventually the while loop will end and we'll move on. Does that make sense? So it's useful for something like you have an array of values, right? So we have this array up here of names. If you want to know how many variables are in an array, you can run count on it, which is a function. We have 4 names in the array, so it's going to compute to that. And then at this point, we can manipulate the variables within the array, and maybe within our while loop, we're unsetting one at a time, unsetting that array, or unsetting that value within the array. That's how you get rid of a variable that you don't want anymore, is to use the unset function. And so maybe somewhere within here we're unsetting one name at a time. And so that's going to leave the names array with 1 less than it had before, and so eventually your while loop is going to end. But that's how you run something multiple times without having this problem.
You can just put like while this happens for this like period of time, you can put a time period on it or timer.
But whiles can, like I said, whiles can be very dangerous because they will just keep on running until it's no longer going to compute as true or compute as whatever you've defined it as.
So
Similar.
how do you stop them? You just need to put
You need.
the string that you were doing
Right.
before?
I didn't give very good examples. Let me give you a better example. Let's say while an hour is less than 24. And we've already defined earlier in the script an hour is equal to 8.
Yeah.
So we're going to say echo hello, it's an hour clock, and put in a line break, and then we're going to say an hour is increased by 1. You can use plus plus to increase a number by 1. You can use minus minus to decrease it by 1. You can simply type an hour is increased by 1, whatever makes sense for you. There's all kinds of shortcuts in the code, and I'm just sort of whipping out a bunch of shortcuts, but you get the hang of it as you go, and you always find new ones. I just found a new one last week. So. But in this case, it's going to say, hello, it's 8 o'clock, and then it's going to say, hello, it's 9 o'clock, hello, it's 10 o'clock. It's going to keep going until it reaches 23, and then it's going to stop. Because at that point, an hour is equal to 24, and it stops running the while loop. So there's an example of a while loop that you might want to have.
Then it will stop.
And you can't just have it happen once, like, well, if it like, I guess you just use like an if then statement, if this is true.